There is a very specific kind of silence in a 300 square foot studio apartment when you know you are the only one to blame for being there. It is a heavy, ringing quiet. I am 58 years old. 2 years ago, my retirement portfolio was robust enough to guarantee a comfortable, upper middle class existence for the rest of my days. Today, I am drinking instant coffee out of a chipped mug in a part of Rio de Janeiro where the police sirens outnumber the tourists, completely separated from $400,000 that I practically gift-wrapped and handed away. I spent my entire career as a senior project manager in civil engineering back in Chicago. My job was to anticipate structural failures before the concrete was even poured. I read blueprints, I assessed risks, and I built rigid contingencies for every possible disaster. I was the guy people paid to spot the cracks in the foundation before the building collapsed. That is the most humiliating part of all this. I wasn't a naive kid. I wasn't an idiot who didn't know how the world worked. I was a professional skeptic. And yet, I methodically, logically, and systematically dismantled my own life. I haven't told my 2 kids in the States. I haven't told my old colleagues. As far as anyone back home knows, I am living the dream in a beachfront penthouse, enjoying the warm weather and the early retirement I worked decades to earn. They don't know about the astronomical legal fees I can barely afford. They don't know that I am legally tied to a woman who views me with absolute cold contempt. They don't know that my carefully planned next chapter was completely erased the moment I signed a property deed over to someone who never loved me for a single second. It is incredibly easy to look at a man in my position, read the headlines about romance scams, and think, I would never fall for that. I'm too smart. That is exactly what I thought. I assumed I was holding all the cards. But the truth is, you don't surrender your life savings because you are stupid. You do it because the lie is custom built to look exactly like the one thing you didn't realize you were starving for. Let me tell you how you lose everything you've built, one perfectly rational decision at a time. For 3 decades, I did not make a single decision that wasn't backed by a spreadsheet, a stress test, or a contingency plan. When you manage large-scale civil engineering projects in a city like Chicago, you do not rely on hope. You rely on physics. You calculate the load-bearing capacity of steel, you account for wind shear, and you assume that eventually the ground will shift. My entire professional existence was dedicated to eliminating surprises. I applied that exact same methodology to my life. I was the guy who read the fine print on every insurance policy. I maxed out my 401k every year, built a highly diversified investment portfolio, and owned a 4-bedroom house in the suburbs free and clear. I built a life that looked exactly the way success is supposed to look. I was pragmatic to the core. Even my divorce was a masterclass in risk management. I was married for 20 years. We raised 2 great kids, paid for their college tuitions, and when they finally moved out, my ex-wife and I looked at each other across the kitchen island and realized we were just 2 polite roommates sharing a Wi-Fi password. There were no screaming matches, no shattered plates, no dramatic betrayals. We sat down with a mediator, divided the assets cleanly down the middle, shook hands, and walked away. It was a perfectly executed logical transaction. By the time I took early retirement at 56, I thought I had crossed the finish line. I had won the game. But no one warns you about the deafening physical silence of a Tuesday morning when you no longer have a purpose. For 30 years, my phone rang 50 times a day. People needed my approval, my signature, my expertise to solve complex problems. I was vital. I was the man with the answers. Then, overnight, the phone just stopped ringing. I wasn't Arthur the senior project manager anymore. I was just Arthur. An aging man sitting in a meticulously clean, empty house, watching the Chicago snow pile up against the window pane. I realized, with a quiet kind of horror, that I had spent my best years diligently building a financial fortress, only to lock myself inside it completely alone. I felt an invisible, suffocating weight pressing down on me. I had money, I had health, and I had absolutely nowhere to be. I was starving for something I couldn't even name. A desperate, embarrassing need to feel relevant again, to feel like my presence mattered to someone, to feel alive before it was too late. So, I did what I always did. I looked for a practical solution to a structural problem. I decided I needed a radical change of environment, and I approached it like a procurement bid. I analyzed the data. I wanted a warm climate, a vibrant culture to contrast my gray routine, and a favorable exchange rate to maximize my liquid savings. Rio de Janeiro checked every logical box. It was a calculated adventure. I rented a beautiful, highly secure apartment in Copacabana. I told myself I was just relocating my assets to a sunnier latitude. The plan was solid. I would live comfortably but modestly, learn Portuguese, integrate into the expat community, and maybe find a casual companion to share dinners and travel with. I had absolutely no intention of getting married again or complicating my financial setup. I was firmly in control. I thought I was making a geographical shift. I didn't realize that in leaving my rigid, scheduled life behind, I had also stripped away the armor that had kept me safe for 58 years. I believed my intellect was enough to protect me, but logic is utterly useless when you don't realize you are using it to justify a quiet, desperate loneliness. I didn't move to Brazil on a whim. That's what people usually assume when they hear about an older guy relocating to South America. A midlife crisis wrapped in a Hawaiian shirt. But I didn't own a Hawaiian shirt. I owned spreadsheets. When the reality of retirement finally set in, the silence of my Chicago house became deafening. For 30 years, my identity was entirely tied to my output. I was the guy holding the clipboard, the man signing off on multi-million-dollar structural blueprints. I solved problems. I was necessary. Then, suddenly, the alarm clock stopped ringing at 5 a.m. The emails stopped coming. My kids, busy with their own lives, called every other Sunday out of duty. I realized I had spent my best years building financial security, but I had absolutely no idea how to live. I needed a project. I needed a change of environment to jolt my system out of the gray, creeping stagnation that was settling over me. I approached the move like a procurement bid. I analyzed cost of living indexes, healthcare infrastructure, and expat community sizes. Rio de Janeiro emerged as the logical winner. The exchange rate was highly favorable, allowing me to stretch my liquid savings significantly while my property back in the States generated steady rental income. The climate was a perfect antidote to Midwestern winters, and the vibrant culture felt like the exact opposite of my scheduled, sterile existence. It was a calculated adventure. I wasn't looking to reinvent myself, and I certainly wasn't looking for a new wife. I just wanted to feel the sun on my face and perhaps prove to myself that my life wasn't entirely in the rearview mirror. I rented a beautiful, highly secure apartment in Copacabana, right on Avenida Atlantica. It was upscale but reasonable within my budget. I unpacked my things, set up a modest home office to monitor my investments, and enrolled in a private Portuguese course. The plan was solid and perfectly contained. I would integrate slowly, make some expat friends, enjoy the food, and maybe, eventually, find a casual companion to share a dinner or a weekend trip with. Nothing messy, nothing that required merging finances or compromising my hard-earned peace. For the first few months, the plan worked flawlessly. I had my morning coffee looking out at the ocean. I walked the promenade. I felt a renewed sense of energy, a physical lightness I hadn't experienced since my 30s. I told myself I had successfully engineered the perfect final chapter. But beneath the surface of that perfectly executed routine, the foundation was hollow. I was living in a city of 7 million people, surrounded by music, movement, and life, and yet I was entirely unseen. I could go days without having a meaningful conversation. The expat meetups were full of guys just like me, divorced, slightly cynical men comparing tax strategies over overpriced beers. I didn't want to compare tax strategies. I wanted to be looked at the way I used to be looked at when I walked onto a job site. I wanted to be relevant. I wanted my accumulated experience, my stability, and my presence to matter to someone. It was a quiet, desperate kind of starvation. And because I had masked it so well behind a facade of rational choices, I had no idea how vulnerable I truly was. I thought I had built a fortress around my life, not realizing I had left the front door wide open for anyone who knew exactly what kind of validation I was dying to hear. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, about 5 months into my new life, in a quiet, wood-paneled cafe in Ipanema. It wasn't a tourist trap. It was the kind of place where locals hold business meetings over small cups of espresso. I was standing at the counter, completely out of my depth, trying to dispute a bizarre overcharge on my internet bill over the phone while simultaneously trying to order a coffee. My Portuguese was still practically non-existent, limited to polite greetings and fumbling apologies. The barista was losing patience. The line behind me was shifting. I could feel the familiar irritating spike of my own incompetence, a feeling I absolutely despised. Then, a voice next to me cut through the confusion. "Let me help. The billing system here is a nightmare even if you speak the language." I turned around and saw Camila. She was 34, though she carried herself with a quiet gravity that made her seem older. If you have a preconceived notion of what a Brazilian woman looking to scam an American expat looks like, erase it. She wasn't wearing loud clothes, she wasn't overly made up. She wore a tailored linen blazer, simple silver earrings, and had a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She looked like an executive. She looked exactly like the kind of professional I used to sit across from in boardrooms back in Chicago. She took my phone, spoke rapid, authoritative Portuguese to the telecom operator, resolved the issue in 90 seconds, and handed the phone back with a soft, apologetic smile. When I offered to buy her coffee as a thank you, she refused. She actually put her hand up, pulled out her own card, and paid for her espresso. "I pay my own way," she said, picking up her cup. "But you can sit with me if you want to complain about Brazilian bureaucracy." That was the hook. I didn't know it at the time, but it was a masterstroke. By refusing a $5 coffee, she entirely disarmed a lifetime of ingrained skepticism. I sat down, expecting polite small talk. Instead, she asked me what I did for a living. When I told her I was a retired civil engineer, she didn't glaze over. She asked about load distributions. She asked how project managers handle supply chain failures. She told me she was an interior designer and that she was fascinated by the structural integrity of the buildings she worked on. For 2 hours, I wasn't an aging retiree killing time. I was Arthur Pendleton, the expert. I was interesting. I was being listened to by a beautiful, intelligent woman who was leaning in, hanging on my every word, completely captivated by my mind. I left that cafe feeling a physical rush of adrenaline. Our connection was a slow, deliberate burn. If she had pushed for intimacy, my defenses would have gone up. I was a risk manager. I knew how to spot a transactional relationship, but Camilla never rushed. We spent weeks just going to cultural exhibits, walking through the botanical garden, and having long dinners where we talked about architecture, history, and family. She started bringing me small, highly specific gifts. One afternoon, she showed up with a vintage book on the engineering history of Rio's aqueducts. Another time, it was a bag of artisanal coffee from a small farm in Minas Gerais that she remembered me reading about. They were inexpensive things, but they proved something vital. She was paying attention to me. She even inoculated me against my own doubts. We would be walking down the boardwalk, and she would subtly point out a 70-year-old European man holding hands with a 20-year-old girl in a bikini. "It makes me sick," she would whisper, shaking her head. "Those girls give our country a terrible name. I could never be with a man I couldn't respect intellectually." I felt incredibly safe. I felt chosen. She introduced me to her family relatively early on. It wasn't some dramatic affair, just a Sunday lunch at a modest, spotless apartment in a traditional middle-class neighborhood. Her mother cooked, her uncle asked me polite questions about America. It felt normal. It grounded her in a reality that completely erased any lingering paranoia I had. But looking back, the architecture of the lie was already showing stress fractures. I just chose to paint over them. The first crack was her interior design business. For someone who was supposedly an independent professional, I rarely saw her drafting plans, and her phone never rang with client emergencies. Yet, she wore designer shoes and always had the latest smartphone. When I casually asked about her current projects, she would give vague, highly technical-sounding excuses about zoning permits being delayed by the city. It sounded plausible enough. I let it go. Then came the banking issues. It started small. We were out for a nice dinner, the check came, and she confidently handed over her debit card. It was declined. She looked mortified, frantically checking her banking app, explaining that the Receita Federal, the Brazilian IRS, had temporarily frozen her account due to a systemic glitch with her tax ID. She was so embarrassed she practically had tears in her eyes. "I've got it," I said smoothly, handing the waiter my card. "Don't even worry about it." It was $150. To me, it was pocket change. A week later, the glitch was still preventing her from paying her internet bill, so I covered that too. Then it was a grocery run for her mother. It was never large sums, and it was always accompanied by profound apologies and promises to pay me back the moment the bank cleared the hold. I didn't care about the money. Actually, if I am being brutally honest, I liked it. I liked being the provider. It made me feel powerful, capable, and needed. The most glaring warning sign came from a guy named Gary, a loud, retired guy from Texas who lived 2 floors below me. We were in the elevator one morning, and he casually asked how things were going with Camila. I was surprised he knew her name. "Just be careful, Artie," Gary said, staring straight ahead at the elevator doors. "I saw her around last year. Used to come into the building a lot with a German guy. Older fella. He went back to Munich practically bankrupt." The doors opened. Gary walked out. I stood there for a moment, the blood pounding in my ears. I felt a flash of pure, defensive anger. I didn't question Camila. I questioned Gary. I told myself Gary was a miserable, lonely old man who spent his days drinking at the corner bar. I told myself he was jealous. I rationalized that to a guy like Gary, all dark-haired Brazilian women probably looked the same. I went upstairs, pulled out my laptop, and looked at my investment accounts. The numbers were solid. My safety net was intact. I told myself that even if she was trying to get something out of me, I was the one holding the cards. I was only helping out with small, everyday expenses. My main assets were locked away in the US. I was a professional risk assessor. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I was in complete control. That is the lie you tell yourself right before you step off the ledge. You convince yourself that because you can see the ground, the fall isn't going to kill you. There is a psychological threshold you cross when you start paying for someone else's life. You don't cross it all at once. You cross it in increments so small, so seemingly rational, that by the time you are funding a stranger's existence, you have completely convinced yourself it was your idea to begin with. The escalation didn't happen with demands. It happened with manufactured crises that only I could solve. A few weeks after the banking glitch, Camila's interior design business hit a sudden wall. She came to my apartment one evening, completely deflated, carrying her old laptop. She explained, holding back tears of frustration, that she had just lost a major commercial bid because her computer couldn't handle the heavy 3D rendering software required for the presentation. She was ambitious, she was working incredibly hard, and she was being held back by a simple lack of capital. I didn't see a scam. I saw a structural inefficiency. I saw a bottleneck I could eliminate. The next morning, I took her to an electronics store in Barra da Tijuca and bought her a top-of-the-line MacBook Pro and paid for a year's subscription to an enterprise AutoCAD license. It was nearly $5,000. She cried right there in the store. She hugged me, buried her face in my chest, and told me that no man had ever believed in her mind before. Most men just wanted to show her off, she whispered. But I was actually investing in her future. Investing. That was the word that kept my defenses asleep. I wasn't a sugar daddy buying affection. I was an angel investor seed funding a promising enterprise. It appealed directly to my ego. I was the senior partner, the wise executive guiding the young, brilliant professional. Gradually, my entire daily routine warped to revolve around her. I stopped going to the expat meetups. Camila subtly discouraged them anyway. "Those men are so cynical, Arthur," she would say, resting her hand on my knee. "They sit around drinking and complaining because they don't have what we have. They don't understand real partnership." I agreed with her. Why would I want to sit with bitter, lonely retirees when I had a vibrant, beautiful woman who made me feel like the center of the universe? I willingly isolated myself, cutting the only lifelines that might have offered an objective view of my situation. Soon, I wasn't just managing her business logistics. I became the load-bearing pillar for her family. Her uncle needed a minor surgery, and the public health queue was too long. I covered the private clinic fee. Her mother's car broke down, threatening her ability to get to work. I paid the mechanic. None of this felt like extortion. It felt like being a patriarch. For the first time since my kids left for college, I was necessary. If my phone rang, it was because someone desperately needed Arthur Pendleton to fix a problem. That feeling is a powerful narcotic when you've been starving in the silence. Then came the lifestyle upgrade. Copacabana had been perfectly fine for my initial modest plan. But as Camila spent more nights at my place, she began pointing out the flaws. The noise from Avenida Atlantica was disrupting her design focus. The building security wasn't tight enough. If I'm going to be leaving my expensive equipment here, we need something safer, she reasoned. Notice the pronoun, we. Within 2 months, I broke my lease and rented a stunning, massive apartment in Leblon, the most expensive neighborhood in Rio. My monthly rent tripled from $1,500 to $4,500. I rationalized it immediately. I told myself my portfolio could easily handle the increased burn rate. I told myself I deserved the luxury. But the cracks were there, staring me right in the face. One afternoon, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a WhatsApp message from a contact saved only as a single emoji, a black square. The message popped up on the lock screen. Did he transfer the money for the permits yet? I stared at the screen. My chest tightened. I could feel the cold, sharp edge of reality pressing against my throat. I knew, in that exact second, that I needed to pack my bags, walk out the door, and never look back. But I didn't. When she came out of the shower, drying her hair, I casually asked who the black square was. She didn't even blink. She sighed, looking exhausted, and explained it was her shady material supplier in São Paulo. She used an emoji because he was under investigation for tax evasion, and she was just trying to get her imported marble released from customs without getting legally entangled. She then showed me a heavily redacted PDF of a customs invoice on her phone. It was a flimsy, convoluted excuse. A first-year engineering student could have spotted the holes in it. But I nodded. I accepted it. You see, admitting she was lying meant admitting I had been played. It meant the guy in the elevator was right. It meant acknowledging that the last 8 months of my life were an elaborate fiction, and that beneath this beautiful, curated existence in Leblon, I was still just a lonely, aging man who had to buy his way out of solitude. My ego simply could not sustain that kind of collapse. So, I built a cognitive bridge over the warning signs. I told myself that business in Brazil was just inherently chaotic and that I was applying rigid American standards to a developing market. I convinced myself I was still the one in control because I was the one signing the checks. I chose the comfortable lie over the devastating truth, completely unaware that I was standing right on the edge of the cliff, happily building the very machine that was about to push me over. The decision that destroys your life rarely feels like a leap into the abyss. It usually feels like a sound investment strategy. By our 8th month together, the Leblon apartment felt too small, not in square footage, but in ambition. We were functioning as a unit now. Camila had casually convinced me that renting was a terrible use of capital in a market where property values in Rio's South Zone were climbing. She was right, objectively speaking. I was bleeding $4,500 a month on a lease when I had the liquidity to buy outright and secure an appreciating asset. We started looking at real estate. It became our shared project. We toured dozens of properties until we found it. A stunning, sun-drenched penthouse in Ipanema with a wraparound terrace and a direct view of the Dois Irmãos Mountains. The asking price was $400,000. In Chicago, that wouldn't buy you a decent view of a brick wall, but here, it bought a masterpiece. It bought a future. I told her I wanted it. I told her I wanted us to live in it. That was when the bureaucratic reality of Brazil conveniently reared its head. When I met with a local real estate attorney, highly recommended by Camila's uncle, he laid out the sheer nightmare of a foreign national purchasing high-end real estate. The capital gains taxes, the repatriation fees, the endless delays with the central bank, the absurdly high foreign investor tariffs. It was a logistical swamp. There is a simpler way, the attorney said, tapping his pen against his mahogany desk. If you are planning a life here, you marry her. You put the deed in her name. As a Brazilian citizen, she bypasses the foreign tariffs entirely. The transaction clears in days, not months, and you save roughly $60,000 in taxes and fees. I am a project manager. I look for the path of least resistance to maximize efficiency. $60,000 was a massive sum to lose to government friction. We sat in the car after that meeting, the engine idling. Camila didn't pressure me. In fact, she looked out the window and told me she didn't want the apartment if it made me uncomfortable. She said we could just keep renting, that she didn't care about the view, she only cared about us. She played the reluctant beneficiary perfectly. I didn't see a scam. I saw a puzzle that I alone had the power to solve. I wanted to be the provider. I wanted to give this brilliant, beautiful woman the life she deserved, and I wanted to outsmart the system while doing it. We were married at a civil registry office 3 weeks later. No big ceremony, just a few signatures and a modest lunch. 2 days after that, I authorized the wire transfer. $400,000, the bulk of my liquid retirement savings, the money I had spent 30 years accumulating in early mornings and late nights on freezing construction sites, moved from Chicago to Rio de Janeiro in a matter of seconds. I signed the property deed over to Camila. I felt no panic when the pen left the paper. I felt profound, overwhelming pride. I had engineered a flawless final chapter. I had secured my legacy. And for a short, beautiful window of time, the universe seemed to validate every single choice I had made. The weeks following the purchase were the happiest of my life. Camila was electric with gratitude. The vague distractions, the minor stresses that used to occupy her, vanished completely. She was entirely focused on me. She hired contractors to redo the terrace, consulting me on every tile, making sure my home office had the best natural light. A month after we moved in, she threw a dinner party to celebrate my 58th birthday. It wasn't a wild bash. It was an intimate, elegant gathering on our new terrace. Her family was there, along with a few of her friends. She stood up, raised a glass of imported wine, and gave a toast. She looked right at me, her eyes shining in the soft lighting, and told everyone how I had changed her life. She called me her rock. She talked, very casually, about the guest room and how perfect it would be for a nursery in a year or two. I sat there, looking out at the ocean, listening to the laughter of her family, surrounded by expensive furniture in a penthouse I had bought, holding the hand of a young, stunning woman who was talking about having my child. I felt like an absolute king. I felt like I had won a game no one else even knew how to play. I went to sleep that night completely convinced of my own genius, blissfully unaware that the foundation had already been entirely removed from underneath me, and the building was just waiting for gravity to take over. In engineering, we say that a building doesn't fail when it collapses. It fails the exact moment the load exceeds the structural capacity of the steel. The actual collapse is just gravity finally catching up to the math. My collapse took exactly 3 months. 3 months after the property deed was registered in her name, the environment shifted. It wasn't an argument. It was an absence. Camila suddenly landed a major commercial design project in São Paulo. Almost overnight, she was spending 3, sometimes 4 nights a week out of town. The intimate dinners stopped. The affectionate texts turned into brief, logistical updates. I was back to sitting alone in a silent house, only this time, it was a $400,000 penthouse. The truth didn't come from a dramatic confession. It came from a dead battery. I was rummaging through her bedside drawer one afternoon, looking for a spare charging cable. Tucked underneath a stack of silk scarves, I found a secondary phone. It was an older model, kept completely silent. It wasn't locked. I opened it. There was only one active WhatsApp thread. The man in the profile picture was Brazilian, roughly her age, smiling on a beach. The messages stretched back for years. I sat on the edge of the custom-imported mattress I had paid for, scrolling through thousands of texts. I didn't need to be fluent in Portuguese to understand the photos, to understand the tone. And then, I found a message from 2 days earlier. "Is the old man still there?" he had written. Her reply, "Just a little longer. The deed is clear. I'm just managing the exit." There is a specific kind of physical cold that floods your chest when your entire reality is abruptly erased. I didn't shout. I didn't break anything. I walked out to the kitchen, sat at the marble island we had picked out together, and waited. When she walked through the front door a few hours later, dropping her keys on the counter, I slid the phone across the smooth stone. I expected panic. I expected her to cry, to invent another elaborate lie about an abusive ex or a dangerous misunderstanding. But the mask didn't slip. It was simply removed. It was instantaneous. The soft, adoring woman I married vanished completely, replaced by a stranger with eyes like dead glass. She didn't even look at the phone. She looked at me. "You need to pack your things, Arthur," she said, her voice completely flat, devoid of any warmth. "Under Brazilian law, this apartment is exclusively mine. If you are not out by tomorrow morning, I will call the police and have you removed for trespassing." I fought it, of course. My ego demanded it. I hired the most aggressive local attorneys I could find. We sat in a stifling office in downtown Rio, and they looked at the documents. They told me what I already knew. I hadn't been robbed. I had willingly, legally, and enthusiastically gifted a $400,000 asset to a Brazilian citizen. The legal fees to contest it were astronomical, bleeding my remaining liquid savings dry for a battle they assured me I would lose. So, I packed 2 suitcases and walked out of the penthouse. That is how you end up in a 300-square-foot studio in a neighborhood where you don't walk outside after dark. I am completely separated from my money. I am legally tied to a woman who is dragging out our divorce solely to ensure she retains every cent. My retirement safety net is severely compromised, reduced to whatever rental income trickles in from my property back in Chicago. I haven't told my kids. I haven't told my old colleagues. When my son calls, I lie. I tell him the weather is beautiful and the beach is just steps away. I cannot bear the crushing humiliation of admitting that their father, the master planner, the man who spent his life anticipating every structural failure, was systematically dismantled by his own arrogance. The deepest pain isn't the lost money. Money is just math. The deepest pain is the absolute certainty that she never loved me for a single second. Every smile, every touch, every late-night conversation was a calculated shift on a spreadsheet. I thought I was too smart to be scammed. But a scam isn't about intelligence. It's about recognizing what a person is starving for and offering them a banquet. I wasn't buying real estate. I was buying relevance. I was terrified of growing old, terrified of being forgotten, and I used my wealth to purchase the illusion that I was still the hero of the story. I look out the barred window of this studio now, listening to the police sirens echo off the concrete. I spent my entire career building rigid contingencies to keep the ground from shifting beneath my feet. I just never realized that the most dangerous structural flaw wasn't in the blueprint. It was the quiet, desperate loneliness I refused to look at, buried right in the foundation.